Okay, hi guys, I'm back in today, and today, guys, we're doing a documentary of the life and story of my grandmother.
And I am his grandmother. My name is Beth Bergman Riley.
What
And
stuff have you seen in your lifetime?
oh, I wouldn't know where to begin to what I've seen in my lifetime.
How about you start off with your childhood?
I had a very unusual childhood. I was kind of the pioneer generation of divorced parents, and I was on my own at a very young age. I ran away from home and never looked back when I was a teenager. And shortly after that, I found myself in Washington, D.C., playing in clubs for money. I played a guitar since the age of 8. I left the country with a number of people, 8 people in specific, who were going overseas because they had broken the law. I did not know anything about their law breaking, but I left on a passport as a surrogate. So I ended up without a proper passport a few years later.
Could you tell us what a surrogate is? I can't say the word.
I posed as somebody's daughter.
Oh.
However, you could get your own passport in the 1960s at the age of 12 without parental consent. And so I had one of my own, but it was hidden. I left the country officially without showing my passport. We left by Icelandic Airways, which is now going out of business, just most recently in the past few days. But it was strange. We crossed the Atlantic without a jet. We were traveling in a plane. It took about 40 hours to cross the Atlantic in the late 1960s. No seats. We were all sitting around in the cargo department of this massive plane, and you could see the waves beneath you. Really, it was it was the first time I'd ever been on a plane. And we landed in Luxembourg and went down to Greece, and pretty much after that I was on my own. I parted company with these people that I'd left the country with because 2 of them were professional mercenaries who were wanted in the Congo because they'd fought along Che Guevara. And of course, the Congo won and Belgium lost. And I posed as the daughter of one of these 2 gentlemen. And that's how I ended up in Europe by myself with one guitar alone
What
for 6 years.
What did you do in those during those 6 years?
I traveled a lot. I got on board of a ship one time in Sweden and worked my way around on the third deck down, worked my way around the coast of Africa. I spent 6 months on this ship out of Göteborg. That's Gothenburg to us. I was on board illegally, but I did that for about 6 months and played music also. I ended up in Germany. I ended up in Africa. I ended up in all of the communist bloc countries. It was just like a constant string of travel. But I ended up hooking up with a rock band in Germany, an English rock band, in Hamburg specifically. Some of the clubs that the Beatles played in, like the Star Club, and a couple of other ones whose names I've long forgotten. That was in the late 60s. And I ended up going to England with this band. And I settled for a while with a wonderful family near the town of Bath in a little town called Bradford-on-Avon in the county of Wiltshire. And they were a lovely family. They had a number of daughters, one of whom had died the previous year of pneumonia. And this lovely family, for the sake of privacy, I won't mention their name, but they treated me like a daughter. They were wonderful, and I still think fondly of them. The mother of that family worked in a boat factory all of her life. They lived in a weaver's cottage that was 500 years old at that time. It still had the weaver's hooks in the walls of the pantry. And I would raid the pantry in the middle of the night. and eat a can of their wonderful marrow fat peas, one of the British foods that I came to love. And of course, you can't get things like that here, but I still have a love for British Marmite. Um, Eventually, I went to the Bath Pop and Blues Festival in '69 or the spring of '70. I think it might have been the spring of 1970. And it was, I imagine, very much like Woodstock, but it came before Woodstock. There were 200,000 people there, and it was very interesting because the British moms and dads were sitting on the roadway on their porches with their cups of tea, watching this endless parade of people from America and from all over the world going down the road, so crowded as you can well imagine. And the Hells Angels actually flew their motorcycles there, and some of them were accompanying, I was told, the Jefferson Starship or Jefferson airplane at that time. And the British people on their porches were just wide eyed. They could not believe all of these people that were there. But the same as Woodstock that would come a few months later, it rained for 3 days. The place was a mess. They had set up a few public toilets at the Bath Pop and Blues Festival to accommodate 200,000 people. And you can well imagine what they looked like after waiting 2 hours to get in. You didn't bother to go in. You went elsewhere. But the land was absolutely decimated. Every fence post was torn up. The venue was a little different than it would be for Woodstock a few months later, which I was not at because I was still overseas for quite a while. They had the stars of the day. I remember the most seeing Frank Zappa, a foot taller than everyone else around the crowd. And I had a Melody Maker press card, so I could get quite close to the inner fence and look at these famous people. The Jefferson Starship were among my favorites. I couldn't even really tell you all the names of the people who played at that concert, but I'm sure you can look it up. It was June 30th, I believe, of 1970. I seem to remember the date, but I'm a little fuzzy on the year. But that concert was one of the highlights of my memories in England. I met a lot of interesting people there. And just like Woodstock, everybody, except possibly me, was high as a kite. Unbeknownst to my peer group at that time, I was afraid of drugs. I did not like drugs. I would pretend to and keep my eye on everyone else around. But the entire crowd was high on something. Some of them, their pupils were so dilated that their eyes were completely black. And after that, I should tell you about Amsterdam. Oh my. I remember seeing Pink Floyd when they had pimples on their face coming out at a club called Fantasia, where I was playing also. It was near the red light district in Amsterdam. And it was just a great big warehouse converted into a 3-story hippie place where you could go and drink tea, or you could go and play music, or you could go on the second floor and listen to up-and-coming bands. And there were mattresses all over the floor and people just exhibiting raucous 1969 and 70-ish behavior. But I remember Pink Floyd. I thought that was such an unusual name. They still had at that time Syd Barrett with them. And the loss of Syd Barrett was a shame. He went mentally ill, completely off the rails, but he was an incredible musician. I would encounter Syd Barrett later, a few years down the road. Noah, can you pause this for a while? I have to collect my thoughts. I should have made notes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, what Noah really wants me to tell you about is a little bit of misinformation that's come out since the death of Jimi Hendrix. And I will lead into that. although I have many, many more stories that are more interesting than this one.
You can tell them, too.
I did not know Jimi Hendrix. I'd never met him. I wasn't a huge fan, uh, but I loved a few of his songs, like Who Doesn't Love All Along the Watchtower? That song was written for him, I'm sure. He did the best version of that just captured everybody's attention. But leading into that, I had found myself in London, back and forth between the circuit clubs of Hamburg to London, and a few other cities. And I ended up staying in London after I left Wiltshire, after the Bath Pop and Blues Festival. And during that time that I played at a club called the Bumpers Club. But prior to that, I met a man by the name of Philip Harvey while I was on the way to the Bath and Blues Festival some months earlier. So I ended up staying at his flat, which was number 4 Clark's Mews, in London W2 in 1970. And during that time, Philip and I went to Ireland. He took a cab all the way across Ireland because he wanted to see an island that John Lennon and Yoko Ono had bought. They bought this island called...
Okay. No.
They bought this island called Dorrange Island off the coast of Westport. And Syd Barrett from the Pink Floyd had picked up this island after Yoko Ono ditched it and left a gold-plated gypsy caravan right there on the island, which had been pilfered by probably all of the Irish locals. You have to take a boat to get to it. Dorrange Island was about 2 miles total coverage, and it was covered with nothing but scrub grass. And Syd Barrett had a huge tent out there. People were paying him £3 a week to come out there and dig stones and help
How
him
much
build
is
a house.
£3?
£3 in those days was roughly about $10.
That's nothing.
But that's what Syd Barrett was doing. But after that time, he went completely off the rails. I don't know whatever became of it. But Philip Harvey wanted to meet Syd Barrett. Philip interviewed a lot of people. He was the son of a member of the House of Lords, so a lot was expected of him in those days. You could not have scandal. You just could not have scandal. There had been so much of it rock the British lordship for a number of years, and to have scandal would mean you might be disinherited if you were the expected son to take the place in the House of Lords one day. So Philip was very guarded about who he let into his life, and he had a penchant for interviewing famous people. A lot of famous people got brought home to his house, like Richie Havens at one point by me, and Jimi Hendrix at one point by me. I was driving with Philip. Actually, he was driving an Alfa Romeo car, which he'd bought for a love interest by the name of Jennifer, whom I never met. But the Alfa Romeo was white, and it had to be driven once in a while. So on this wonderful September day, Philip decided he should take it for a drive, and he took me with him. And because it had American steering, I was sitting on the passenger side, and we pulled up to a red light on Bayswater Road. It was September 16th or 17th. It was the day before Hendrix died, the day before. So it had to be the 16th, or maybe the 17th. But it was one of those 2 days because the 17th is my brother's birthday, and I remembered it profusely. But at the red light, because of the position of the cars, the passenger seat, which I am in, was facing the driver's seat, was facing the passenger seat, rather, of the car beside me. So both passengers were side by side. And I happened to glance over my shoulder. We were right at Bayswater Road, across from Hyde Park at this big intersection. And here's Jimi Hendrix looking at me. He had a big purple pointed hat on with a feather in it, and he looked rather small. And I just looked at him and said, "Hi, man." He says, "Hi, man, how you doing?" I said, "Fine." And I elbowed Philip. Look who's there. So Philip casts his eyes, sees Jimi Hendrix, but he looks around Jimi Hendrix to the driver, who was a girl he apparently knew. And they had some chit chat right there at the red light about, Philip saying, "Well, that was a long time ago, Monica, and never mind it, we were teenagers." And uh, we followed them to a hotel off of Bayswater Road, near the recording studio that I would later be in, Island Recording Studios. And Philip made arrangements because I'd invited them. "You want to come to our house?" You know, I wasn't a lover of Philip's. I was just living there. That to be clear. Philip was a good, good man.
I was about to say.
And I hope he still lives and still is a good, good man. But they agreed to come to our house later that evening. They had some business to take care of and some calls to make. So we went home. We gave them our address and went home in the Alfa Romeo. All right. We were waiting to see if they would come. I mean, Philip was a little on edge. And he went back out. But this time, he took his regular car, the blue Mustang, dark blue Mustang, the car in which he had been when I met him some months prior. And when he came back, he was accompanied by a girl I had never met before, a young girl by the name of Penny. She was 16 at the time. She had short, straight, not too short, but maybe collar length, straight, dishwater blonde hair, not a stitch of makeup on her. She was beautiful and normally built and quite laid back and very soft spoken. She didn't have much to say at all. She was just kind of waiting. But Penny had met Philip somewhere and he brought her home for this potential meeting. Eventually, Jimi Hendrix and Monica Danneman did show up at Philip's house. The sun was still up. It hadn't gone down quite yet when they came. And we sat around. Philip broke out a little table of hashish and made some vodka and lime and offered it to whoever. And I believe Monica had a glass of wine. Nobody got drunk. Nobody got carried away. There was nobody else there except the four of us. Five of us. There was Penny, myself, and Philip. And there was Monica and Jimmy. I could tell you in my memory exactly where everybody sat. There was no furniture in this particular room. It was throw pillows. Old fireplaces had been turned into setting areas. And the only stick of furniture in that entire room was a stereo and some records. The whole back wall was windows that looked out into a little overgrown bit of brush, which is hard to find in downtown London. And Clark's Mews was kind of closed, not a lot of sound there because it was cobblestone on a slight downhill grade. And there was a long walkway in the house, a long hall that led to this room and 3 steps up to the room in which we were all entertaining one another. Well, what was left out of Philip's story when he finally told about it after the death of his father? You see, he made Penny and I promise not to tell anybody because of his position in society and the fact that he might have been disinherited. And I kept that promise for 46 years. And because I didn't have a computer, I never knew that Philip came forward with the story to Scotland Yard upon the death of his father. Sometime in 95, he wrote the story, but I never knew about it. And all these specials on the television I never watched. It didn't occur to me that nobody knew where Jimmy was for those 2 or 3 missing hours prior to his death, but he was at 4 Clark's Mews because I was there. What, however, has been left out of the conversation on Philip's end, and I don't know if Penny ever said anything or not, was the conversation that Jimi Hendrix had in Philip's house that night with Philip and with me. I was the mouth. I was the mouth. I was the one carrying on the conversation. Jimi Hendrix talked about numerology, which I knew nothing of at the ripe old age of 19 at the time. I lied about my age and said I was 18. I told Penny I was going to do so because we didn't want them to think we were groupies or run them off in any such way. More out of respect for Philip than for the stardom of Jimi Hendrix. He was very soft-spoken, very laid back, and he did not seem well. His eyes were puffy. His hair was a mess, and it was teddy bear brown. It wasn't black. You could tell it was Jimi Hendrix, and I could tell you what he was wearing right down to the ankles that day. But I'll keep that in reserve because somebody who wasn't there wouldn't know it. He apparently changed clothes after he left. But we talked for a good 2 hours. We talked. He talked about numerology, and he said to me, I don't know if you're into my music. He said, I'm into numerology, like that song I wrote, If 6 Were 9, that's just fine. And I said, well, yes, I'm aware of the song and all of that. And he was trying to explain to me, he asked everybody's ages. Monica was 29, I believe, like Philip at the time, 27 or 29. He asked my age, and I lied. I said I was 18 when in fact I was 19. And Penny was, of course, 16. And he did something with those numbers and said the time was right. And I had no idea what he meant, the time was right. But he was talking about his dissatisfaction with the recordings that he had to do and what he was nailed into, that he felt not free to be himself. And he was a little bit downcast and a little bit very much overtired. He was very tired. I could tell it. And Monica sat behind him with her knees Indian cross style and sometimes drawn up to her chest. She never said a word. He introduced her as his friend. This is my friend, Monica. He said not one word about a love interest. But she had on the most terrible makeup. She had on 1.5 tons of pancake makeup, to which I was embarrassed for how much makeup she had on her face. It looked like...
that was a style, though, I thought back in the days.
Oh, no, it looked not
Like
stylish
Kiss?
at all. Oh, no, it looked like terrible. I can't explain it. It looked like you could peel it off in sheets or scrape it with your fingers. It was awful. And I was embarrassed that she had so much makeup on. At the time, I think her face was pockmarked, and she was attempting to cover that. That's the only thing I can think of, except that she resembled Mary Travers of Peter, Paul, and Mary, but not nearly as pretty at that day and age. It was something about the straightness of her hair, but her demeanor seemed very unfriendly, even though she didn't have much to say. But I did take note of that. And at one point, when Philip was talking about his dissatisfaction with the recording industry and wanting to change the things that he had to do, he made a comment, oh, I wish I had a guitar. Oh, my word. How do I describe this? But right hand to God and all that I believe in, every word of this is true. Philip didn't play guitar. Penny didn't play guitar. Okay, Monica didn't play a guitar, but I had played since I was 8 years old. So Philip puts me on the spot, and he says, we have a guitar here. She has a guitar. Laid on the floor, clear on the other side of the room, and I'm thinking, oh gosh, tail between my legs. Philip says, why don't you offer him your guitar? My guitar was a top-of-the-line gut string guitar. Giving a gut string guitar to Jimi Hendrix would be like giving a rowboat to the captain of the Queen Mary. Okay, his expertise was upside down, left-handed on an electric. My playing ability was right-handed on a gut string or a 12-string acoustic guitar. It's like the difference between a very fancy hoverboard and a Maserati car. They don't operate the same way at all, even though you can, in theory, play the same notes. So Philip hands my guitar to Jimi Hendrix, who's sitting back like this on the pillow, and he's got my gut string guitar backwards and upside down with his left hand. Okay? And he's plunking at it. To him, it's like rubber bands, I'm sure. And he got a half smile and he says, "Oh, I can't play this fucking thing." And he looked at me sheepishly. And Philip put me on the spot. He said, "She plays very well. Why don't you play a song?" Oh, I wanted to just crawl under a rock and disappear. You know, a little folk singing American teenager playing a gut string guitar in front of a world famous person like Jimi Hendrix. Well, being on the spot and being my brother's birthday coming up, I decided to take a chance on a poem my brother had written that I was trying to put to music. It was called Beautiful Child, and many of the lyrics to it I've already forgotten. I played 2 or 3 songs, and Jimi Hendrix said, "That's great, man, that's great." And Monica Danneman commented upon Philip's request, "Yes, she's very good." I was extremely flattered and complimented, and that is the God's honest truth. I played my guitar for Jimi Hendrix the night before he died, and he played my guitar, or at least he held it and plunked at it, and he said he would like to come back. He had plans to come back. He didn't plan to die. But Monica kept urging him. I guess it might have been 10 o'clock. I'm guessing at the time. We have to go. We have to go. She began to kind of bug him. And so he agreed. He was very tired. Philip got up to go to the cloakroom to get his denim jacket, which Philip had graciously hung up down the 3 steps and off to the right. And when Jimi Hendrix and Monica walked down the long hallway, Philip held his hand back because Penny and I intended to follow them and say goodbye outside in the courtyard. But Philip held us back, like to stay in the room, and so we did. So Philip accompanied them outside, and the last I remember of seeing Jimi Hendrix, he was in the doorway with a light right over his head, reflecting behind him. And he said, "We'll see you soon. We'll be back." And he was directing his conversation at me, honest to God, more than at Philip, more than to Penny, and more than to Monica. And it had nothing to do with a boy-girl thing. It had all to do with music. That is the truth. He said he wanted to come back. And apparently, when Philip accompanied them outside, Monica began screaming and yelling, and there was some sort of altercation, which I did not see. But anyway, that's how I met Jimi Hendrix. And of course, I was horrified the next morning when it was all over the news that he had died. When we had seen him, he looked fine. Nobody was drunk. Nobody was out of control. We didn't even play any records. We had a very quiet chat for about 2.5 hours. No running around, no partying, just the songs that I played and the discussion about numerology in music. And yes, he was talking to me, and less so to Philip. It's like Philip was asking him questions, but Jimi Hendrix was answering them to me. Now, when Philip came forward with his report, he gave the name Penny Ravenswood or Ravenshill as being the young girl that had just come that night and never before. And he gave my name as being Ann Day. My name is not Ann Day. Ann Day was from Canada. I never met her, but I knew all about her because Philip had been to Canada, and I guess she was a love interest at one point for Philip. There were pictures of her with no clothes on in Philip's bathroom, taken in the Canadian woods. They were not smarmy pictures. They were very tasteful pictures of somebody just kind of posing like a child of nature in the trees. Nothing tawdry or questionable about them, just kind of the fashion of hippie days. But no, Ann Day was not there. Not once in the 5 months I was in that flat. But some months later, I left there, and I believe Philip was very angry with me over an encounter that occurred when Roman Polanski was brought home. Roman Polanski had, the year before, lost his wife to the Tate LaBianca murders. So I never was able to speak to Philip again, but there's a lot more to that story I would like to tell about Philip. And Philip, should you ever see this, I hope you are well and still living, and I hope that you forgive me for anything you think I did wrong. You gave me a place of respite in a time when I needed it the most. And as far as Jimi Hendrix goes, that's what went on. And I've always wanted to tell his loved ones or his children about the conversation that night, because the conversation that night was left out of everybody's venue, and apparently I'm the only one who knows some of it. And that's the truth. And sometime later I ended up back in America after many, many more adventures, and many more to come.
What did you do when you got back to America? How you met?
When I got back to America, I settled in New York City, just for a brief time. After I had a knife held to my throat in my own doorway and nearly killed, I left New York City. I ended up playing some ski resorts in Vermont, and then I took up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for a while with my brother, and I took off playing state fairs and carnivals, hooked up with Billboard magazine the next summer to see America, since I'd seen a lot of the rest of the world. So I saw a great many states. And the last show I did, I should tell you about meeting Greg Allman at the Alabama State Fair. No, that's a fact too. That was a piece of work. Oh boy. But my last show was